This is Vivian from PharmaSalon. Before you watch, I want to let you know that if you're interested in getting a CE credit for this video, go to the show notes below. There's a link to the Compounding CE website that will take you directly to the quiz for this class. The show notes also include the questions on the quiz, so be sure to check them out. While you're there, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to this channel.
All right. Hello, everybody. I'm Rachael Pontikes, and I'm here with my colleague, Emily Hussey, and we are going to give the BHRT update. So before we do that, we're just going to go through some requirements of the program. So first, we have to do our disclosures. We don't have any conflicts of interest to disclose. As I'm sure many of you know, Emily and I are attorneys. We are at the law firm of Reed Smith, as this says, and we represent a lot of compounding pharmacies in this space. So we don't have any conflicts of interest. Okay. Here are the learning objectives for this portion. You are going to understand how BHRT, we're going to talk about compounded BHRT, is currently regulated by federal and state agencies. We're going to then turn to the latest steps by FDA to regulate compounded BHRT, which, by the way, for everyone stands for bioidentical hormone replacement therapy. Then we're going to talk a little bit about the recent study that was completed by the National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Math, or NASEM, regarding the clinical utility of CBHRT and what is coming next. Okay, so we're going to start with a little bit of how compounded BHRT is regulated. And it's really not regulated any differently than any other compounded medication. So as many of you know, if you're participating in this, compounded medications are regulated at both the state and federal level. The Federal Food and Cosmetic Act, Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act does regulate compounding drugs via a section called 503A. And there are different pieces of 503A that govern the regulation of compounds. And they regulate things like what type of materials are used in the compounding of certain drugs if a commercially available drug product is not used as a starting material. So that will come into play in terms of the compounding of BHRT. Other than that, the conditions under which BHRT is compounded are, of course, controlled at the state level. Most states incorporating USP 795 and for non-sterile, which is a lot of this, and also 797 for the sterile pieces of CBHRT. Also, there are compounded BHRT that are compounded in 503B facilities. A lot of pellets come from 503B facilities. There are also 503A that compound pellets, but those are also compounded by a 503B outsourcing facility. So the regulation, just on its face, is really not different than the regulation of any other compounded drug. You have 503A, which is traditional compounders, 503B, outsourcing facilities, different sets of regulations, and then you have the state regulation for each of those types of drug producer, whether it be an A or a B, and then you will have kind of fallout from there. So on its face, there should be really no difference between CBHRT and any other compounded drug. So why, oh why, are we giving this presentation? Emily, next slide.
And before we switch slides, just to kind of set the stage, I think it's important to note that, compounded BHRT was really not, for the most part, introduced until the 1980s or so, and it was to treat menopause. And then, as we'll get into in this next slide that we're talking about in terms of FDA's push to regulate CBHRT, one of the things that came about was that FDA approved BHRT wasn't really getting good feedback. And there were some studies that came out that suggested that, federally approved BHRT had some negative effects. And so what you saw, in around the end of the 1990s and early 2000s was an explosion of the use of compounded BHRT to treat a wide variety of things. So that's kind of setting the stage for why, while compounded products shouldn't be treated any differently in terms of the overall regulation, you're seeing just this kind of concerted frame of reference in terms of the focus on compounded BHRT and its kind of recent explosion in the last several years in use across the country and by physicians who are increasingly using it over using an FDA approved product. So that sets the stage for kind of what we're going to talk about now, which is what FDA is doing or has been doing to start kind of, inching its way towards increasing regulation over compounded BHRT.
Mm-hmm. That's right, Emily. Thank you. Those are really good points. Mm-hmm. So really the concern started with the 2002 Women's Health Initiative, WHI study, which found that FDA approved, so that would be anything that's gone through new drug approval, hormone medications raised risk of heart disease, blood clot, and certain cancers. And there's a lot of discussion among experts about what this WHI, Women's Health Initiative study, showed and didn't show. And so there's a lot of discussion, but those are the findings as we've reported in the 2002 Women's Health Initiative study. Then we see in 2008, FDA is initiating a lot of enforcement actions, specifically against 7 pharmacies that specifically compounded BHRT. So again, a focus on this drug post the 2002 Women's Health Initiative study, like Emily said, which had driven a lot of physicians away from the commercially available product and to compounded CBHRT. And one of the reasons that happens, and I think that really hormones are the best example of compounding and why compounding is necessary and vital to healthcare, is because they can be so idiosyncratic that women sometimes need a little bit more of this, a little bit less of that. Men who have hormone issues, they're very sensitive, and they need the compounding community and compounders to constantly be tweaking this a little bit up, a little bit down, a little bit in between. So hormones are just a quintessential example, really the one that I give if I'm going to give an example of why do we need compounded drugs. So that's what these compounded pharmacies started doing, because why? Always coming from physician need and request. Physicians were requesting these medications. And, that was in reaction to this 2002 WHI study. So then, after the 2008 enforcement action, we had FDA responding favorably to a citizen's petition that was submitted by a commercial manufacturer of FDA-approved hormone replacement therapy products, asking FDA to take action against compounders of CBHRT. So just to review, and a lot of case law came out of this, and the case law here reestablished the position that FDA has enforcement discretion, and it is FDA who chooses who and who not to bring enforcement actions, prosecute, inspect, et cetera. And really, you can't have commercial entities, drug manufacturers, whoever they are, compounders, members who are not members of the government or members of FDA, determining how and when to use FDA's resources. So this favorable response then led to a cascade of events, which ended up in lawsuits and elsewhere, reestablishing the principle that FDA and FDA alone is going to make a determination of how to use its enforcement actions and its resources to properly protect public health. I just wanted to mention that. They did respond favorably there, but the cascade of events is not where all of that landed. Okay, then FDA published press releases and participated in press conferences regarding its position against CBHRT. So again, FDA coming out very strongly, specifically against this medication, leading up to FDA commissioning NASEM, that was the National Association Science, Engineering, and Math, to study the clinical utility of CBHRT in 2018. And that's kind of really interesting. I want to pause there, and then I want to give Emily an opportunity to weigh in on some of this. If compounds do not have to go through new drug approval, and what does that mean? They're exempt, right? It means that they don't have to prove that they are safe and effective to treat a certain type of disease. So why don't they have to prove that? Well, because, again, what I said before, they're very idiosyncratic. You are making adjustments up, down, et cetera. Congress recognized that the new drug and the Supreme Court in Western states recognize that the new drug approval process is an especially poor fit for compounded medication because you won't ever get the data and the statistics to be able to demonstrate that this drug has this effect because there's generally not enough of it for it to be worth it to take this drug through new drug approval because it doesn't treat that large of a population and because you're making these tweaks. So this was a very interesting move by FDA in 2018 that they said, okay, we want NASEM to say the clinical utility. In other words, they asked NASEM to put compounded BHRT, which of course is very idiosyncratic, through basically a new drug approval process, right? Because they want to say, is it clinically useful or not? In a way that FDA is not supposed to be doing because these are compounded medications and specifically exempt by Congress under the Food, Drug, Cosmetic Act under 503A. Emily, what do you have to add to that?
Yeah, so, and Rachael did a really good job of kind of showing the steps that FDA has taken over the last several years in terms of its kind of targeting of BHRT and compounded BHRT specifically. And I think it's been interesting to see what FDA has been doing. I don't want to say it's unprecedented, but it's certainly unique in FDA taking the steps that it's been taking, issuing the press releases that it's been doing, just kind of getting its voice out there, specifically as it relates to compounded BHRT and trying to steer not only public perception, but, private entities and, commercial companies into just kind of this overall, negative perspective of compounded BHRT, trying to steer people towards FDA approved hormone replacement therapy, which one of the reasons, again, that as I said, that CBHRT has exploded is because FDA approved products really just can't meet patient need. So it's been interesting to see FDA take these steps over the past several years, specifically on this subject in a way that we really haven't seen them do in other contexts. So, it's more of just an anecdote to note as we're seeing this, that FDA is really kind of putting its opinions out there in a way we haven't seen in the past. It'll be interesting to see how this goes. And, as we move forward in this conversation with everyone on this call listening in, we're going to talk more about what comes next. But it's been interesting to kind of watch FDA do what it's doing for the past several years.
And that's a really good point, Emily. And I think it's more than just an anecdote. I mean, they're really putting their thumb on the scale here in a way that they have an opportunity to do when the drug goes through new drug approval, but they specifically don't when it comes to compounding. So forcing it through that mini new drug approval is really the unprecedented piece. It really is FDA weighing in a way that they don't weigh in on any other medication because it's not appropriate, quite frankly.
Right.
Yeah, good point. Okay. So issues with the NASEM study. So when FDA goes to look for an expert upon who it's going to rely, it is governed by this statute called the Federal Advisory Committee Act, or FACA, that's the acronym for it, Federal Advisory Committee Act. And the Federal Advisory Committee Act does say and require that the committee, and if you look at number one, we have here, is not subject to any actual management or control by an agency. So that's what FACA directs. It says, yeah, go ahead, agencies, any agency, use an advisory committee, but they're not supposed to use an advisory committee to mask what is actually the agency's opinion by just giving it the imprimatur, cloaking it in objectivity and independence, which we basically sent a FOIA to FDA. We then had a bunch of documents produced, which demonstrated that that's actually exactly what FDA did. FDA steered this study but while simultaneously saying in the grant that it sent to apply for the money from HHS, that it wanted this study to be of unparalleled objectivity. Okay, that's what they said, to get our federal taxpayer dollars to pay for this. And then what FDA did, a series of things that are, arguably, and we believe, violated the Federal Advisory Committee Act. So first they kind of stacked the deck as to who was going to be on the committee to review this, to basically get involved and review this issue. And remember, the issue was the clinical utility of bioidentical hormones. This study was then kind of predicated on multiple forms of bias. Some of it was gender bias. Some of it was bias against compounded drugs in general. There was not a single person on the panel who actually prescribed and used compounded drugs. So it was asking a bunch of people who don't actually use the medication, not the physicians who are using the medication, to come forward and form an opinion. They did hear from some physicians who are knowledgeable in this space, but that was only after basically that they're prodding and that evidence was dragged before them, but they were not part of the core group at all. We also found that FDA and NASEM, this is all from the documents that were given to us via the FOIA from FDA. We also published all this information in both of our comments that are publicly available comments, and they attach all of these emails. So this is all public information. We also found that FDA and NASEM collaborated throughout the process, and that before the report was finalized, NASEM gave FDA the pen to make revisions, which is obviously violating FACA, right? But also violating NASEM's own internal rules. So they should not have been given the opportunity to review and comment. They should not have been able to handpick basically the committee, and they should not have collaborated to the extent that they did, because then it's not independent and objective, which is what they said their goal was when they went to get that money from HHS, and what they're supposed to do if you look at FACA. And why is that problematic? Like, who cares? Well, one, they're supposed to do this for Federal Advisory Committee Act, but two, FDA should want to get objective evidence from people who actually use, physicians who actually prescribe the medication, to understand its clinical utility. Because again, what they were supposed to be determining and discussing was clinical utility. So NASEM conclusions. With a deck stack like that, no one was surprised that NASEM concluded that compounded BHRT does not have clinical utility. And that the reason they concluded that was basically because they being the study, the people on the study, in conjunction with FDA, they forced these medications basically through a new drug approval process. They were looking for types of studies that you would find if something went through the new drug approval process. And of course, to no one's surprise, these medications don't have those studies because they're not required to go through new drug approval. And why aren't they required? Because, as recognized by Congress, Supreme Court, these medications are a poor fit. That's what the United States Supreme Court said in Western states, a poor fit for the new drug approval process, because they don't treat a population that's big enough in a one-size-fits-all fashion. So basically what? The compounds failed. The test we would expect them to fail, right? Not surprising to anyone. And we came out with this conclusion from NASEM, which was supposed to be independent, but didn't actually entertain or listen to doctors who actually use this, that there's no clinical utility. Emily, what do you have to add to that before we do the what comes next?
Yeah, I think I would just, again, taking kind of a 50,000 foot view, what happened here is, again, we talked about these concerted efforts over the last several years of FDA's kind of, step by step kind of, taking action against compounded BHRT, putting comments out there that's, discredit CBHRT in a number of ways, all leading up to this study where, again, the National Academy of Sciences is federally funded. We know that, but the idea is, although FDA commissioned the study, there was supposed to be kind of a disconnect there where National Academy of Sciences should have been allowed to do the study in a way that, ensured that it had all of the different kind of, voices in the industry to look at, that there wasn't any sort of bias. And what we saw instead was, when we looked through the documents that we received through the FOIA requests, was, again, it just was kind of a consistent FDA position throughout the study to steer the conclusion that it wanted, which was that, as NASEM found, that there wasn't, enough evidence to show the clinical utility of compounded BHRT, which of course, will inevitably lead to concerns of patient access then, because you're going to have issues and, there's hundreds of thousands of patients all around the country that use and are able to, obtain benefit from these products. And this NASEM study, because of its inherent flaws, is going to have serious ramifications that Rachael and I are going to talk more about, in the next several minutes. But it's just interesting to kind of see that. And this isn't meant to bash FDA in any way. It's just that, FDA is interested in the public health, as is everybody else in the industry. And so there's nothing wrong with commissioning a study like this. It actually could be beneficial. But the problem is that the conclusions it reached are inherently flawed. And so it sends an industry into a tizzy based upon flawed assumptions that, inevitably are actually going to result in patient harm.
Right.
So that's what we saw.
Yeah, and I think that's a really, really good point about there's nothing wrong with a study like this. And, that's why the Federal Advisory Committee Act requires this type of independence, because you want independence. But, when we looked at this, we saw anything but. And that's really the problem here, is the interference and driving towards a conclusion instead of allowing the evidence, the physicians, really independent to evaluate this, because as we're going to talk about in a minute, this therapy is critical for vulnerable populations. So you want a true assessment of this therapy to be able to allow it to continue to be available for these critical populations. And like with any compounded drug, this is not over the counter. This is not something where it's FDA is policing what is available to someone over the counter. You have a physician, right, who's got to prescribe this in the middle. And the physicians are using their medical judgment. A physician, she's determining, is this appropriate for my patient? So what you're doing is basically interfering with the physician's judgment and not allowing the physician to have a full panoply of medication at her disposal to properly treat. So that's the issue. And I think, we always have to remember that in a compounded situation, and in this situation, the physician's judgment is standing there. This is not an over the counter. Okay, so let's spend a little time talking on what comes next. So we have filed 2 public comments. The ball is squarely in FDA's court. FDA they don't have to do anything with the NASEM study. They could do nothing with it. They could decide to go back, comply with the Federal Advisory Committee Act, have a study redone. That's certainly possible. That could be something they do. They could decide to do nothing with it. They could take the NASEM study conclusions and they could then, examine issues like, are hormones demonstrably difficult to compound? That was something that was inserted into the study. That was never an objective of the study, never have been discussed during the study, but for some reason it was. And one of the conclusions NASEM found was that the PCAC, that Pharmacy Compounding Advisory Committee, they basically should look into see if hormones are demonstrably difficult to compound. So that could happen. And that is a serious issue and a problem for compounding, because it raised a host of issues. PCAC is raised a host of issues. That committee, the way that it was formed, it is potentially problematic. And the way that committee kind of suspends things before it goes through the rulemaking process, also highly procedurally problematic. So that could be a real problem for compounders if that happens. Also, with a finding that compounded BHRT is not clinically useful, that also could lead FDA to mount an even bigger campaign against, part of for a 503B, part of the analysis of whether or not raw materials can be used that have to be in a positive list is clinical need. And if FDA has a finding that there's no clinical need, that could be a serious problem. So this is there's very real risk and a serious potential downside about what FDA could do with this study. And that's why it's so important. That's why APC has a campaign going on about it. That's why so many people are engaged in this issue, because this really threatens to undermine access to medication for very vulnerable populations. The transgender population uses compounded bioidentical hormones. Fertility issues, menopause issues, andropause. These are vulnerable populations who definitely need the support and are currently being supported by the medical community. And FDA has chosen to go in a different direction, unfortunately. So that's why this is so important, because it has a lot of very serious potential downsides. Emily?
Right. Yeah. I mean, again, best case scenario, nothing happens. The study just is out there and, FDA does nothing with it. The industry kind of, okay, we take note of it. We understand what NASEM's conclusions were, but, compounded BHRT prescription continues and patients continue to receive the treatment. It's possible that some prescribers could look at this study and, decide not to continue prescribing such medication, which would obviously be detrimental to patients. So there could be a possibility of maybe some kind of just freezing effect in terms of some prescribers prescribing the medication. We haven't really seen that yet, but it's possible. And again, FDA has a lot more going on right now in terms of a national pandemic that is somewhat distracting them. But what we did see in the FDA's recent, budget request is that they plan to increase oversight over compounded facilities. They're going to double, or if not triple, the number of inspections that they're doing at facilities in the next year. That's the hope, right? And so in terms of, if we're kind of thinking of what comes next, even if FDA doesn't really take any action specifically on this study, we don't see any reason to believe that this kind of march to increase regulation over compounding and compounded BHRT in general is gonna stop because of everything else that's happening right now. Mm-hmm. So it is interesting. We're obviously going to be monitoring it. To date, FDA hasn't said anything about the study. And again, as Rachael mentioned, we had put in a comment to FDA, and again, it's publicly available, just, stating a lot of what we discussed now, which is our concerns with the study, encouraging them not to adopt it, encouraging them to kind of reach out to the industry more, engage in further dialogue. Obviously, industry representatives are ready and willing whenever FDA would like to talk to them about this issue. So it'll be interesting to see what happens moving forward. Again, lots of movement in FDA in general right now. So we're monitoring all of it, but yeah.
Right. But no, and I think this is what you're saying, Emily, I just want to kind of reiterate it. This is not an issue to get complacent about. It could be nothing, but the downside is very serious. And that's why you're probably seeing a lot of campaigns about this, and that's right. And that should be happening. And that's why we wrote our comment, then we posted supplements, actually 2 comments. So, because this is a very serious issue.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
I've been reached out to by the APC, and I did do a podcast, which is coming out next week, with, talking about this from 2 pharmacy owners, Peter Koshland and Jim Hinkle. I don't remember his name.
Oh yeah. Mm-hmm.
Right. And they were great. But then they're talking about, I guess if you want, maybe you could put your perspective on the campaign, because one of the things is they're doing is, I guess, a public awareness campaign.
I think that's what to do.
It is. And on what to do. And I was unique for the podcast because they're not really talking to pharmacies. They're actually talking to the public to educate them on this issue in case there needs to be outreach. I mean, what do you really see what's going to happen? I mean, do you think we're going to need to have a public outcry at some point, or you hope? I mean, obviously we're all hoping this will be resolved, this way.
Well, let me answer it this way. I think a lot of people are used to having a full range of different medications available at their disposal. Mm-hmm. You can go the more medicated route, more medical establishment route, but you also, many of us see different doctors who try alternative paths, mm-hmm. which may be more suited for you And we're really heading towards more individualized medication, right?
Yes.
So if you look at the cutting edge cancer treatments, they're working with your immune system, right? So this type of treatment is very much along those lines. FDA resists this. I've tried to tell them, no, this goes in the same category. They don't like it. But I am right about this, by the way. I mean, it is the same type of treatment. And I think people take for granted that those types of treatments are going to be available to them. And it's only going to be when all of a sudden they're not, right? And that's what I know the industry does not want to happen, that all of a sudden it's going to be like, oh my gosh, I've got to write letter, that we really there needs to be public awareness. And I support the awareness campaign because, again, there are vulnerable populations, transgender, women having fertility issues don't really feel like advertising that to the world. But if you're having fertility issues, you want everything available to you.
Yeah.
And so I think this public awareness campaign, and also menopause is the same way, right? Or perimenopause or andropause. Like, these are life stages that sometimes need support from the medical community, from a physician, and from a physician trained to be able to address the issues. So I think the public awareness is very necessary, because there may be a point where the public does need to be engaged. And again, I just want to reiterate what Emily said. No one is trying to be antagonistic towards FDA. And FDA is, of course, always in this balance of, they want things to be safe and effective. They want to take a more conservative, and I understand that. But again, here, we're not talking about an over-the-counter medication. We're talking about somewhere where a doctor, a physician and the physician's judgment is squarely in play.
Mm-hmm.
The comments that Emily and I filed in the NASEM study had all these different declarations from doctors. They were MDs, and they had this FACOG, designation, which is faculty of, I don't remember what it stands for, but it's like an exclusive OBGYN designation. And they're prescribing these medications, right? We're not talking fringe. We're talking the medical establishment.
Yeah.
Right. And so I think these are medications that people are used to having available. So there needs to be public awareness, because that's here. It's not some right. And I
was gonna say, I know Peter and Jim were looking forward to testifying with the FDA or talking to the FDA, and they were both grilled for, I think, 3 or 4 hours. And Peter had said that he was really looking forward to it because it was an opportunity to really put forward, his experience and the research, and really kind of outline, the argument. And he was pretty disappointed to find out that nothing that they had talked about made it seem to make a dent in moving in the report. I'm struggling still with the right terminology in the report, in the guidance.
It was a study in the report. Mm-hmm. And I mean, I think, Vivian, that I'm glad you brought that up, because that's an issue, is why are they so dug in? Like, what, in the FOIA, that FDA was upset. Like, they were like, what are all these people coming out of the woodwork at the last minute in support of this? Like, excuse me, if you're trying to get objective, right, and you want the study to be inclusive, shouldn't you be happy that the physicians who are actually using this, like, the whole steering piece of it is just highly suspect?
Yeah.
Listen, my husband is a scientist. You have to constantly rethink your suppositions if you're not right? You're mad at more evidence? I don't understand this, right? And again, the declarations in the submission, we put it in NASEM, we had FACOG after FACOG, and everybody had an MD, right? So,
yeah.
And to be as charitable as possible to FDA, what Rachael was saying, which is, they obviously have a really hard job, right? I mean, they're being asked to essentially ensure that there is safe and effective medication for, hundreds of millions of patients across the country every day. And they tend to take as a result, they tend to be pretty rigid. They get comfortable with the way that things are moving, and they want to see that happen all the time. And they're not really willing to consider other methods of treatment and other ways of doing things that might be more appropriate for a lot of patients in the country. So again, we understand that, but the fact of the matter is that compounded BHRT in particular is not going away. And the more that it's used and studied, there's, millions of different patients that have different issues are seeing real benefits from it. So the FDA has to come to kind of the table there. And the more that there is a public campaign about this issue, about positive impacts that patients, the physicians that are using it and seeing positive reinforcement in the patients that are being treated by it, the better. And our hope is that FDA, rather than taking this kind of rigid anti-position against compounded BHRT, really reconsiders and thinks about what its negative position could mean for patients around the country. So, we'll see what happens there.
And I want to say something about the data, because it's kind of interesting along the lines of what I just said about the MD and that FACOG designation. So one of their conclusions, the NASEM study's conclusion was, well, we want more data, but they recognized it couldn't be the same type of data as going through new drug approval. Well, that felt very disingenuous because reams and reams and reams of observational data was actually submitted, right? The type of data compound actually have. So this is what we're talking about. Like, they act like it's like, magic beans or something. And it's so far from that you're, that you shouldn't have a stonewall mentality, because as Emily said, I don't providing benefit from it, but also, as I've said, the medical establishment is prescribing it, right? And there is data to support it. So, we're not so far as we think here, right? Yeah. And so then it just becomes, why is this mindset? Because to us, it doesn't seem to make sense from the public health perspective. And again, no FDA bashing, not what we're doing. We're just, we would all like, and it sounds like that's what your other panel is talking about, more FDA true engagement on this issue and not adversarial engagement. Yeah. Everybody like, hey, let's see if we can get this right to, as corny as it is, help patients, right?
Right. It's an important therapy to a lot of people. You can't just shut it down and have a negative perspective. So I think is what we're all saying. You got to be
right. And supported by the medical establishment and by observational data. So you're like,
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much. I think that wraps up this one.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching. Remember, if you would like ACPE credit for this lecture, click on the link below and register for the class. You won't have to watch the video again, just answer the quiz questions. And don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel so you can be updated on all our latest content.